What will 2015 bring to Ukraine? This is a question that is obviously uppermost in many people's minds, both in the Ukrainian diaspora and in Ukraine during our Christmas celebrations, and looking forward to Malanka in the middle of January. Certainly the projects that Putin had in place in the springtime have not come to fruition. These projects to create a so-called Novorossiya, New Russia in eastern and southern Ukraine, have failed. They failed for a variety of reasons. Putin underestimated Western sanctions. Took a long time coming. It took the Malaysian Airliner, unfortunately, to be shot down in July, but they did eventually come, and they have begun to hurt Russia at the same time as the oil prices is collapsed. And the Saudis are talking about even pushing the oil price down to $20 a barrel. This would be a disaster for Russia, which is in 2014 based its budget on an oil price of $95 a barrel. This is also a disaster because Russia has never tried to diversify. It's in effect a petro-mafia state, a Nigeria with nuclear weapons. And therefore, with this money not being used for modernization, with this money just being stolen, when the oil price and gas price, which is based on the oil price, collapses, then there really isn't any other areas of the Russian economy upon which to look back to. So in this sense, Russia is very different from the three other BRIC countries of Brazil, India, and China, who are rising powers. The crisis in Russia today shows to what degree Russia is a declining power. So Russia's in crisis. There wasn't support found in the 8 Russian-speaking regions of east and southern Ukraine for Putin's project. In 4 of them, Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Mykolaiv, there was zero support. In 2 of them, there was some support in Kharkiv and Odessa. These were the swing regions. But the pro-Ukrainian forces mobilized in both of those cities and defeated the pro-Russian separatists. So the only success in some ways was in Donbass, but even there they only control a third of the territory, half the population. So not even the entire Donbass, particularly in Luhansk. Now, what can Ukraine do with this situation? It has really very limited options. It can accept the current situation, ignore the separatist regions. De facto, the ceasefire line from September becomes a new border. But it would be unlikely that a president of a country such as Petro Poroshenko would be able to go back on his constitutional duty to defend the territorial integrity of Ukraine and say goodbye Crimea and goodbye these regions to the separatists. This may be an opinion held in large parts of Ukraine because people maybe prefer peace to fighting, to death and destruction. But it would be difficult, if not impossible, for a president to do that. So the other options are to do the Croatian variant, maybe, to build up your forces with American help, with buying your own weapons abroad, rebuilding your own domestic military industrial complex, and training your forces, and then in a few years' time maybe retaking back this region. This is what the Croats did. They were defeated in 1991. A third of their republic was under the control of Serbian separatists, so a larger part of Croatia than Ukraine. But they waited, they trained, they received covert assistance from the United States, and in 1995 they did 2 blitzkriegs and defeated the Serbs, and the enclaves were destroyed. That could be the case, but that was 4 years in the making. So they got rid of the potential for frozen conflicts. But of course the differences there is that Russia wasn't backing the Serbs. So we have seen that Putin potentially would enter the fray and fight send Russian soldiers to fight with the separatists against Ukraine. So it's not an easy, wouldn't be an easy task. But the Russians underestimated in big time the military prowess of Ukrainians, the determination to defend their territory. Putin, to this day, and Russian leaders simply do not understand the concept of a patriotic Russian-speaking Ukrainian. And if you watch any films from Channel 5 on YouTube or elsewhere about the conflict, about Ukrainian forces in eastern Ukraine, you will see that many of them are Russian speakers. There was an interview with the battalion leader of the Azov Battalion, Andriy Biletsky, just a few weeks ago. He's from Kharkiv himself. He's now working in the Ministry of Interior. And he said that half of his Azov battalion speak Russian, but they all die for Ukraine. That and the fact that that Ukrainians are good soldiers, they were good soldiers in the Soviet army and in other previous more nationalistic military forces, was also something that came to the fore in this conflict. So we, in many ways, have a stalemate. It's very unlikely for Russia to invade. Now that would lead to even greater sanctions and the collapse of the Russian economy. And Ukrainians would put up a fight. There is simply no support for separatists in regions that Russia would have to move into to take control of territory. For example, the so-called Crimean land bridge from Mariupol going southwest to the Crimea would be near impossible because it would have to go through oblasts, regions of Ukraine where separatism has zero support. So Ukraine has limited options. What do? Accept the border, try to retake the territories, or something in between, sort of not accept the separatist control, but at the same time ignoring them, as the government is doing by not paying pensions and social welfare. The problem, of course, with that is that innocent people, pensioners, for example, who are just caught up in this separatist enclave, are therefore punished. So the year ahead, and particularly come springtime, Ukraine will have to prepare for any other provocations that come from Russia. Russia is still continuing to send its forces into the separatist control area, and it's attempting to build a more coherent military structure from these different terrorist bandit groups that have appeared in those regions. But there's also another more important development that we should be looking at in 2015. Ukraine is de facto a bankrupt country. Without Western financial support, Ukraine today would be bankrupt. But that Western financial support from the IMF, World Bank, European Union, and from various Western governments is premised on Ukraine doing things. And that includes in particular tough economic, political, legal reforms and fighting corruption. Now, that's also what the Ukrainian public wants the Ukrainian government and president to do. The opinion polls show that, and elections which have been held in 2014 also show that, because it led to the creation of Ukraine's first ever pro-European parliamentary majority, and a constitutional majority voted in December to remove the foreign policy of non-bloc status, opening the way for seeking EU and NATO membership. But it's still not clear to me whether Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk and President Petro Poroshenko understand the tough steps that they have to take. And this is seen in many, many different ways. Opinion polls show that majority of Ukrainians do not believe that anything really has fundamentally changed on the question of corruption in Ukraine. Ukrainian authorities are still not fighting seriously corruption. This is not surprising. President Poroshenko installed in place, it's his prerogative as president, a prosecutor general, Mr. Yarema, who sends a signal that business is as usual, i.e. the appointment of this particular individual as prosecutor general does not send a signal to corrupt elites that business as usual has finished. On the contrary. Why is that? Well, Mr. Yarema was trained in Soviet Ukrainian police academies. He spent the last 2 decades working in the Ukrainian Interior Ministry, but he worked in the 2 most corrupt departments in the Ukrainian Interior Ministry. The Department to Combat Organized Crime, which often worked with organized crime, and the Department on Criminal Investigation. Both of these were very corrupt departments. How is somebody with that background the great candidate for the Prosecutor General of Ukraine in a time after the Euromaidan, where Ukrainians and Western governments and international organizations are demanding Ukraine finally get serious about fighting corruption? So this is a question to President Poroshenko. Now, we will see what comes of the newly established Ukrainian FBI, whether it will appoint a Westerner. There are various candidates, including an old friend of mine, who I've known for the last 3 decades, Bogdan Vitvitzky, a New Jersey federal prosecutor and lawyer, Ukrainian activist, is one of these candidates for the position of the Ukrainian FBI. He certainly would be a very worthy candidate and would be instrumental in trying to push and change Ukraine's virtual campaign against high-level corruption into a more serious one. But until now, what we have is nobody's been punished for the murder of Euromaidan protesters yet, and nobody's been punished for the massive rip-off, the basically massive theft of the Ukrainian budget which took place under Yanukovych. Not a single person has been criminally charged. If President Poroshenko does not have anybody criminally charged, i.e., he will be taking responsibility for that, and Ukrainian opinion polls will reflect that. By November of 2015, the 2nd anniversary of the Euromaidan, there needs to be criminal charges in place. Otherwise, Ukrainian politicians will become unpopular, as they did under Viktor Yushchenko as presidency. So that needs to change. The question of fighting corruption, of rule of law, is something within the prerogative of the Ukrainian president. The government is also involved, but Ukrainians and the Western governments will actually be looking to President Poroshenko for responsibility in ensuring that changes. At the same time, the Ukrainian government can't escape. The Ukrainian government has been, and the Ukrainian political forces around the Ukrainian government have been seeking more power in a highly dubious vote in the Ukrainian parliament with the adoption of a new law on the Ukrainian National Security Council. Alexander Turchinov has become de facto the vice president of Ukraine in his position as secretary of the National Security Council. This is not a good step for democracy in Ukraine. It's not a good step because I don't think Alexander Turchinov is really the right person to take Ukraine into Europe either. This is somebody who has a past linked to Pavlo Lazarenko in the 1990s and to Yulia Tymoshenko. He doesn't speak English, just like Mr. Yarema doesn't speak English. And he's not somebody who I would consider to be a person who associates himself with European values. So we have the government seeking a lot of power, but at the same time the government not really implementing very serious reforms. Anders Aslund talked about the Ukrainian government program, which was adopted a few months ago, as akin to something from the Brezhnev era of the Soviet Union. He didn't regard it as being very serious. Yuri Lutsenko just this week talked about the very weak reforms in the Ukrainian budget and the Ukrainian plans for 2015. So with Arseny Yatsenyuk, somebody who has been a flip-flopper throughout his political life, again we see more a question of rhetoric as opposed to strong substance. Ukraine has 2 fronts to fight. It has an external front which is obvious with Russia, the fight with Russia, the fight with separatists. At the same time, it has a very strong domestic front. Ukrainians will not put up with another failed Orange Revolution, another failed Euromaidan. They will not put up with weak reforms or non-existent reforms, and no serious fight against corruption. That was the case after the Orange Revolution. Ukrainians, in effect, went home from the Orange Revolution tents and passed the buck to the Tsar, the new president, Viktor Yushchenko. That's not going to be the case today. And this is especially dangerous when we have many people in the country with weapons. We have a situation where many individuals who have volunteered to serve in the various volunteer battalions have had to purchase their own weapons, have to purchase their own equipment. Those weapons belong to them, not to the Ukrainian Ministry of Interior or the National Guard. And many of those people have already said that they cannot accept a situation where their comrades are dying on the front line and people continue to steal in Kiev. So we have another source of pressure besides the civil society. We have soldiers and volunteers. In this case, therefore, President Poroshenko and Prime Minister Yatsenyuk are in very unenviable positions. They not only have to fight, well, they inherited a terrible situation from the previous president, bankrupt country, the loss of the Crimea, a war with Russia, but they also inherited a lot of expectations from Ukrainian society and from Western governments that they shouldn't repeat the failures of the past, and they should implement the wishes and the dreams of the Euromaidan and of the voters who supported pro-European political forces in the two elections of 2014. In this sense, 2015 will be a crucial year for Ukraine. When historians look back at the last 25 years of Ukrainian independence, 2015 will be crucial in deciding whether Ukraine breaks away from this Russian invasion and resolves somehow this question, and whether Ukraine also has a breakthrough in terms of its domestic reforms, fight against corruption, and therefore progress on the path to European integration. I'm still not convinced that Ukrainian leaders understand that they have to do a huge number of steps, which is tantamount to a revolution in terms of changing people's minds and policies before they can even enter the antechamber of the EU and NATO. They seem to think still that rhetoric rather than substance will get them into the EU and NATO. And on this, they'll be very surprised to see that this is not the case, and Ukrainian society will not accept this anymore. So Ukraine's elites have to prove their worth this year. They have to prove that they are elites, because until now, they have not proven themselves to the same degree as Ukrainians on the ground, whether in the Euromaidan or on the front line in eastern Ukraine. Let's hope that by the end of 2015, there is that breakthrough, and Ukraine has finally said, bye-bye Russia, goodbye, as the famous Eurovision Song Contest said, and Ukraine enters and moves towards Europe. Thank you.